This is not fiction. These are real beliefs, fully embraced by people who built castles, conquered lands, and shaped history. And yet, their understanding of the world was deeply questionable. You are standing in the heart of a medieval town, surrounded by people who will confidently explain to you why the moon controls human thoughts, why sneezing too hard could eject your soul, and why cats are absolutely involved in a grand, sinister conspiracy. These aren't just random theories. These were deeply held beliefs, whispered in taverns, debated by scholars, and sometimes even written into laws. Tonight, you will witness these conspiracies firsthand, through your own eyes, in your own world. If you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into historical madness. Also, drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Because history, it waits for no one. Now, let's step into the world of medieval conspiracies through your own perspective. You stand in the heart of a medieval market, surrounded by merchants selling questionable goods, townspeople gossiping about things that absolutely should not be true, and scholars arguing over which absurd theory deserves to be taken most seriously. The first thing you notice, absolutely no one trusts the sky, the moon, a direct manipulator of human emotions, the sun, obviously involved in some kind of supernatural war, the stars, secret messages left behind by forces nobody fully understands. And here you are, caught in the middle, listening as the most unhinged medieval theories unfold right before you. This is not just a history lesson. This is your reality now. The medieval market buzzes with energy, filled with voices arguing, whispering, and confidently declaring theories that should absolutely not exist. You walk past merchants, overhearing a conversation between two scholars who appear entirely convinced that the moon is actively controlling human behavior. One of them gestures toward the sky. "You see," he says, "when the moon is full, men grow restless. They fight, they make bad decisions. They lose all sense of reason." You nod politely, even though this explanation completely ignores every other possible reason why people make bad choices. The other scholar leans in, lowering his voice to a dramatic whisper. And that's not all. The moon controls the tides, yes. You hesitate, wondering where this is going. If it controls the water, then it controls the water inside us. You blink. You mean blood? Exactly. He waves his hands in excitement. The moon moves the oceans. Why wouldn't it be moving us? You consider walking away, but it's too late. You are fully involved in this nonsense now. A merchant nearby is loudly declaring that his herbs can protect people from the Pope's secret weather manipulation. You turn toward the commotion, watching as townsfolk crowd around, eager to purchase medieval protection against supernatural storms. "I saw it myself," the merchant says. "The Pope stands atop his grand cathedral, calls upon the heavens, and summons lightning against his enemies." The crowd gasps, clutching their coins, absolutely prepared to buy whatever nonsense this man is selling. You do not know what is worse: that people believe this, or that some part of you is enjoying how deeply committed they are to their own delusions. And then, the worst happens. A sudden, violent sneeze erupts from the back of the crowd. People turn immediately, eyes wide with terror. A woman clutches her chest. "His soul," she gasps. "You must say the words quickly!" Someone shouts. A chorus of voices immediately murmurs blessings, hands raised, some attempting to physically push the soul back into the man's body, as if it is an escaped animal. You watch in absolute disbelief, realizing that there is no reasoning with medieval fear. The sneezer looks utterly confused, watching as 3 townspeople attempt to tie a small rope around his wrist to anchor his spirit. And meanwhile, a cat strolls by, pausing briefly to watch the chaos. And that is enough to send everyone into absolute panic. The medieval market has officially descended into chaos, all because a man sneezed, and a cat walked by at the wrong time. The sneezer looks bewildered, struggling against three well-meaning, but deeply misguided townspeople who are attempting to physically hold his soul inside his body. Someone waves a bundle of herbs in front of his face, claiming that the scent will help stabilize his spirit. Another begins chanting, trying to lure his soul back like it is a lost pet. You watch this unfold, fully realizing that there is absolutely no way to reason with medieval superstition. Meanwhile, the cat pauses, surveying the crowd with its usual feline indifference. And that is enough to make people panic further. "That's not a normal cat!" a man shouts. The market erupts into terrified whispers, people pointing, muttering, edging away like they are witnessing a direct act of witchcraft. The cat does absolutely nothing, except blink once and sit down. You wonder briefly if it enjoys watching humans embarrass themselves. Then, to make matters worse, someone drops a loaf of bread, and instead of retrieving it normally, a woman gasps, because the bread has landed upside down, which, apparently, is a medieval omen for bad luck. You stand there, watching as three simultaneous conspiracy theories unfold before your eyes. The moon is controlling minds. The Pope is summoning storms. Sneezing ejects souls. Cats are absolutely witches. Bread has mysterious powers. You breathe deeply, knowing full well that this is only the beginning. The medieval market has officially lost control of reality, and somehow you are right in the middle of it. The sneezer is still trapped in the clutches of panicked townspeople, who have now escalated their efforts by attempting to wave a spoon near his forehead. Because apparently, silver can anchor the soul. Meanwhile, the cat has done absolutely nothing but blink twice, yet its mere existence has convinced half the crowd that something deeply sinister is unfolding. And the bread? It remains upside down, untouched, feared. A merchant steps forward, dramatically adjusting his cloak like he is about to deliver the most important speech of his life. This moment, he says, voice thick with authority, confirms everything I have been saying. The crowd leans in, desperate for answers. The signs are clear, he continues. The Pope has summoned storms against us, the moon is influencing our thoughts, and now, the sneezers are losing their souls. Someone gasps, clutching their chest. You blink, trying to process what kind of connection he is attempting to make. It makes absolutely no sense. And yet, the crowd nods. The sneezer is finally released, staggering back, deeply confused, but now thoroughly convinced he has narrowly escaped death. The cat turns, flicks its tail, and casually walks away, a move that only solidifies the conspiracy theory further. The bread remains untouched, as if it is cursed beyond repair. And you watch as medieval logic unfolds in the worst possible way. Fully realizing that this nonsense is far from over, the medieval market has officially given up on reason. And somehow, you are still here, fully witnessing the disaster unfold. The sneezer now walks cautiously, avoiding sudden movements like his soul is still fragile and might escape again. The cat, gone, but its brief, uninterested presence has left permanent paranoia lingering in the air. And the bread, still upside down, still untouched, still feared. A man steps forward, raising his arms like he is about to deliver the most important revelation in history. It is clear now, he announces, voice thick with medieval certainty. The crowd leans in, desperate for answers. The Pope has summoned storms, the moon manipulates our minds. And now we see it plainly. See what plainly? You brace yourself for absolute nonsense. Our food has betrayed us. The crowd erupts into concerned murmurs, staring at the cursed upside, down loaf like it is capable of plotting against them. You blink slowly, processing the fact that medieval people have now fully convinced themselves that bread is part of a larger conspiracy. And yet, nobody is questioning it. A merchant adjusts his cloak, preparing for the opportunity of a lifetime. "Fear not," he declares, "for I sell protection against cursed bread." The crowd cheers. You silently acknowledge that medieval business strategies are entirely based on exploiting unnecessary panic. And somehow, it works every single time. The medieval market has reached peak paranoia, and somehow you are still here, witnessing history's most unnecessary disaster unfold. The upside-down loaf of bread remains untouched, a symbol of misfortune that nobody dares to correct. The sneezer now moves carefully, convinced that his soul might still be loose somewhere in the air. And the merchants, they have doubled their prices on protective herbs, fully taking advantage of the chaos. You move through the crowd, catching snippets of conversation, realizing that medieval conspiracies were not just nonsense. They were deeply ingrained fears that shaped daily life. One man speaks in hushed tones, explaining that if the moon controls water, then it must control human bodies as well. Another gestures dramatically toward the sky, claiming that a certain cloud formation is clear evidence that the Pope is punishing their town with storms. And a group of women whisper about cats, their ability to shape-shift, their unnatural ability to remain silent, and the undeniable truth that they are working for witches. You pause, taking in the sheer volume of medieval superstition. None of this is logical. And yet, these beliefs were powerful enough to influence laws, medical treatments, and even wars. The medieval world never runs out of questionable logic, and somehow, you are still fully immersed in it. You move beyond the market, past the fearful whispers about sneezing souls, cursed bread, and moon-induced madness, and enter a new town, one that is absolutely convinced that shadows have their own agendas. As you step into the main square, people immediately stop talking, eyes darting to your feet like they are checking for something important. A woman hisses quietly. "Look," she whispers. You blink, confused. "What? The shadow?" You glance down. It is just a shadow, but clearly, it is not just a shadow to them. A scholar steps forward, adjusting his robes like he is preparing to deliver the most serious warning of your life. "Shadows do not belong to you," he says gravely. You pause, waiting for an explanation. "They move when we move, yes," he continues, "but they do not serve us." You process this statement, fully realizing that whatever comes next is going to be wildly incorrect. They watch. They listen. You blink. They take information back too, well, whatever forces control them. You look at the gathered crowd, fully accepting that they believe every word of this. One man gestures to the corner of the square, where his own shadow stretches along the wall like a harmless patch of darkness. If you move too quickly, he warns, it might take longer to follow you, and when that happens, he lowers his voice. It means it's making a decision. You consider walking away immediately, but before you can step back, an old woman grabs your wrist. "Wait," she says. "You must perform the ritual." The crowd murmurs in agreement, nodding like they all know exactly what she is talking about. You absolutely do not. "What ritual?" As she gestures toward a small, circular stone on the ground. "Stand there," she insists, and turn 3 times, then spit. Then, she hesitates. "Actually, you must whisper to your shadow first. Let it know you mean no harm." You blink slowly, fully processing that medieval people do not just fear their own shadows, they actively try to negotiate with them. The town watches you closely, expecting you to perform the ritual. And honestly, you might as well do it, because medieval superstition never stops evolving. It just keeps finding new ways to confuse you. The medieval town watches closely, waiting for you to perform the ritual that will supposedly protect you from your own shadow. You consider your options carefully. Walk away. Risk offending them. Perform the ritual. Risk questioning every life decision that has brought you here. After a long, slow breath, you step onto the circular stone, turning exactly 3 times as instructed. The crowd leans in. The old woman nods. Now, she whispers, "Spit." You hesitate, fully aware that you are currently attempting to negotiate peace with your own shadow. Medieval people lived in a world shaped by superstition, their daily lives governed by beliefs that, by modern standards, seem entirely detached from reality. The fear of witches spread rapidly, leading to widespread persecution, trials, and executions, often with little to no evidence other than whispers in darkened corners. The mere presence of a cat could doom a person, as felines were believed to be shifting familiars, working in league with supernatural forces. The paranoia became so intense that rulers ordered mass killings of cats, unknowingly worsening their own struggles with rats and disease outbreaks. The human body was considered a fragile vessel, constantly at risk from unseen forces. The left hand carried its own stigma, feared for its association with deception and even the devil himself. People who favored their left hand were forced into correction, sometimes punished or shunned. Bells rang throughout villages and towns, believed to ward off evil spirits and prevent disasters. Some people spent entire days tolling church bells during storms, convinced they could protect their homes from lightning and destruction simply through sound. Disease was rarely understood and often blamed on spiritual corruption. Illness was seen as divine punishment, leading the sick to endure purges, fasting, and self-inflicted suffering in hopes of redemption. Medical treatments bordered on absurd, with physicians prescribing gemstones to balance the body's health or suggesting that bad smells could ward off plague. People carried bundles of herbs, vinegar-soaked cloths, or even roasted animal parts to combat sickness, convinced that stench itself was a form of healing. The power of kings was not just political, but supposedly supernatural. Monarchs claimed to hold divine healing abilities, with entire crowds gathering in hopes that a mere touch would cure their ailments. The belief that royal hands held sacred power was so strong that kings incorporated healing ceremonies into their rule, further reinforcing the idea that their authority came directly from a higher force. Celestial events were met with fear, rather than wonder. Comets were seen as omens of disaster, warning of war, famine, or the death of rulers. Eclipses brought unease, with some believing that the sun and moon were under attack from dark entities. Rituals were performed in hopes of restoring balance to the heavens, often with no clear explanation for why they worked, or why the universe remained unchanged, despite human attempts to intervene. Medieval conspiracies shaped law, medicine, and even the structure of daily life. The whispers of the town became warnings, warnings became fear, and fear turned into traditions that lasted for generations. Superstitions became laws, myths became history, and entire societies adapted to a world governed by beliefs that made little sense. This is the reality of medieval life, where reason was scarce and the supernatural was never far from reach. Let's continue uncovering more, because history only grows stranger the deeper we dive. Medieval logic was less about figuring things out and more about confidently declaring nonsense until enough people believed it. For example, medicine. If you got sick in the Middle Ages, doctors didn't ask, "Did you eat something bad?" or "Were you exposed to disease?" No. They asked, "Have you angered the stars?" Because, obviously, the alignment of planets directly controlled human health. If Mars was looking particularly aggressive, then congratulations. Your headache was now officially a battle between cosmic forces and your unfortunate skull. And let's talk about medieval disaster prevention, because that was an entirely separate mess. If a storm suddenly arrived, it was never just bad weather, it was a punishment. Someone somewhere had absolutely enraged a higher force. The solution: people would gather in town squares and scream at the sky, not beg for mercy, not pray quietly. They shouted directly at the clouds, because apparently nothing fixes a storm like sheer human stubbornness. But let's not forget medieval fashion laws, which were less about looking good and more about making sure people knew exactly how doomed they were. Peasants, forbidden from wearing bright colors because happiness was clearly too expensive. Royalty, allowed to wear fur, gold, and silk, but also burdened with clothing that made basic movement physically impossible. The result: if you saw someone tripping over their own extravagant robe, you knew immediately. Yes, a nobleman. Absolutely useless in a crisis. Medieval belief systems weren't just bizarre. They were deeply committed to nonsense disguised as knowledge. Medieval laws weren't just designed for order. They were built upon wildly inaccurate beliefs, most of which had no scientific basis whatsoever. If a law was being passed, there was a very real chance that someone's argument for it was simply, "Well, my neighbor saw a bird behave strangely, and now we must change how society operates. Let's break this disaster down." One of the most ridiculous laws came from the fear of witches. People genuinely believed that witches could fly, which meant that anyone who owned a broom was already suspicious. In some places, simply talking to your cat too often could land you in serious trouble. If that cat happened to stare at someone too long, forget it, you were absolutely doomed. And since medieval trials didn't require actual evidence, all it took was one bitter neighbor claiming you gave them a strange look to ruin your life forever. Some laws even banned black clothing outright in certain villages, because, clearly, a preference for dark colors meant you were consorting with unholy forces. Let's talk about the laws surrounding bread, because those were absolutely unnecessary. People firmly believed that if bread landed upside down, it was cursed. You could not sell a loaf that had fallen incorrectly. In some cases, throwing away cursed bread was illegal, because what if it angered the spirits? One law even required bakers to mark their bread with a holy sign to prevent it from accidentally poisoning the masses, because, apparently, loaves were at constant risk of turning evil. If your bakery sold a suspicious loaf, the punishment could range from fines to full public humiliation, because apparently bad bread was a crime against humanity. Now, medicine-related laws. Those were somehow even worse, because disease was believed to be a direct punishment from supernatural forces. Some towns banned sick people from walking near churches, in case they contaminated the holy air. Physicians were required to follow astrological charts before treating patients, meaning you could legally be denied care if the stars weren't aligned correctly. In some cases, it was illegal to question medical wisdom, no matter how absurd. So, if a doctor prescribed holding a pigeon against your stomach to cure illness, you weren't allowed to ask why that would possibly help. And what about laws regarding weather? People believed that storms were punishments, meaning some regions had legal requirements to perform mass rituals whenever thunder struck. Some laws banned whistling near the ocean, because sailors believed it could summon destructive winds. During periods of drought, entire villages were required to hold trials for accused rain stealers, because, clearly, someone must have been hoarding all the water. Medieval laws weren't about logic or fairness. They were about keeping fear alive through unnecessary rules. They weren't just ridiculous. They actively made life worse. And somehow, society accepted them anyway. Medieval laws didn't just enforce order. They actively made life more complicated by integrating superstition, paranoia, and sheer nonsense into the very foundation of society. One of the most infamous laws revolved around the belief that animals could be tried for crimes just like humans. If a pig ate someone's crops, it could be dragged into court, charged with destruction of property, and punished accordingly, sometimes with full legal proceedings. If a rooster laid an egg which, to be clear, was probably not an actual egg, but some abnormal growth, people assumed dark magic was involved and declared immediate trials to determine whether the bird was working with the devil. In some places, frogs, rats, and even insects were summoned before judges, because obviously, they understood human law well enough to respond to accusations. And if they didn't, well, that just made them look more guilty. Another spectacularly unnecessary law revolved around questionable food. People were deeply suspicious of eggs, believing they had an unnatural connection to the supernatural. This led to laws regulating how eggs could be handled, because obviously, allowing them to remain unsupervised might lead to sorcery. Other laws banned eating certain fish on specific days, because consuming the wrong seafood could supposedly anger celestial forces. Bread was closely monitored by law, with strict regulations against selling loaves that hadn't been properly blessed, because, clearly, bread had the potential to turn evil without warning. And then there were laws regarding ghosts. Some towns genuinely believed that spirits had legal rights, meaning landlords could be fined if their property became haunted. In one case, a group of knights passed a ruling that ghosts were required to leave a battlefield after sundown, as if they were somehow bound by human curfews. People made contracts promising spirits compensation if they agreed not to disturb local events, leading to documents that legally required ghosts to behave themselves. Because, apparently, medieval society functioned best when even the dead were expected to follow the law. Every aspect of medieval life was tangled in superstition, turning what should have been basic governance into an absolute circus of bad ideas. And somehow, people went along with it anyway. Medieval laws didn't just maintain order. They often made life unnecessarily difficult, usually thanks to a complete lack of scientific understanding and an overwhelming fear of the supernatural. One of the most bewildering legal traditions involved trials by ordeal, which were essentially tests that made no logical sense but were somehow trusted to reveal the truth. For example, if someone was accused of theft, they might be forced to carry a red, hot iron bar while walking a specific distance. If their burns healed properly after a few days, they were innocent. If not, guilty, unfortunately. Since burns are not particularly famous for quick healing, this was more of a punishment than an actual trial. Another ordeal involved throwing accused people into water to see if they sank or floated. If they floated, it meant the water was rejecting them because they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent. But they might also drown in the process. This meant that many trials functioned as a lose-lose situation, proving that medieval logic was less about fairness and more about theatrical suffering. Then there were laws surrounding animals, which truly had no reason to exist. Pigs, dogs, and even goats were frequently put on trial for crimes, including destruction of property, attacking humans, or, somehow, even witchcraft. One court case involved a swarm of locusts, in which the insects were officially summoned to court and ordered to leave the farmer's land, or suffer consequences. Unsurprisingly, the locusts did not appear for their hearing, leading to their immediate conviction. In another case, a donkey was brought before judges to determine whether it had committed blasphemy. Which begs the question, how exactly does a donkey insult religious doctrine? But things got even stranger when medieval laws tried to regulate personal habits. Some towns banned laughing loudly at night, because it was believed that uncontrolled amusement could wake spirits. One city punished people for sneezing incorrectly, because failing to follow the proper ritual of blessing afterward could result in a supernatural incident. Wearing the wrong colors on certain days was considered a direct insult to celestial forces, leading to laws regulating the exact shades that could be worn for specific events. And let's not forget the rules surrounding mirrors, because those were somehow both mystical and deeply annoying. In some places, mirrors were considered dangerous, as they were believed to trap spirits or provide portals for demons. If you stared too long, townspeople might assume you were attempting to communicate with dark forces, leading to serious consequences. Medieval laws weren't just built on fear. They actively made life more complicated, usually in ways that benefited absolutely nobody. And yet, people followed them anyway, because questioning them could land you in even worse trouble. Medieval laws didn't just create structure. They often turned everyday life into a full-scale disaster of regulations nobody needed. If a rule existed, there was a good chance it had absolutely no scientific basis and had been created out of paranoia, hearsay, or someone's deeply misinformed observations. One particularly ridiculous law involved the handling of shoes, because, for some reason, it was believed that incorrectly storing footwear could invite spirits into the home. Some towns actually had ordinances requiring people to place shoes facing a specific direction overnight, because if they were positioned the wrong way, it was an open invitation for ghosts. Imagine getting fined because you accidentally left your boots facing west instead of north. Things only got worse when it came to laws regulating behavior in cemeteries, because people didn't just fear the dead, they assumed they were actively participating in society. Certain regions required official documentation before a burial to ensure that the deceased wasn't faking it, which raises more questions than answers. Some laws even banned eating inside graveyards, because consuming food too close to tombstones was believed to attract wandering spirits who might demand a bite. Then there were the horrendously unnecessary laws surrounding livestock, which often treated farm animals as sentient criminals. In one infamous case, a group of donkeys was accused of spreading disease, which led to a full trial in which legal arguments were made against the accused donkeys. Chickens, meanwhile, had an entire list of offenses they could be charged with, including disturbing religious ceremonies if they clucked too loudly during church services. Things took an even stranger turn when people started outlawing sneezing incorrectly. Some medieval towns required an immediate blessing after every sneeze, and if someone failed to follow this ritual, fines could be imposed. There was even a belief that sneezing without permission inside royal halls could be considered an insult, which meant that allergies were apparently, a direct threat to political stability. Medieval people were deeply concerned about whether celestial events were judging them, which led to bizarre laws regulating how the sun and moon should be treated. Some laws banned staring at the moon for too long, because it was believed that excessive moon gazing could weaken the mind. In one case, a scholar argued that certain phases of the moon caused people to become more reckless, which resulted in temporary laws banning certain activities on full moon nights. Even water wasn't safe from medieval paranoia. It was believed that standing bodies of water could be manipulated by supernatural forces, leading some villages to pass laws requiring ponds and wells to be inspected for signs of possession. This meant that actual officials had to walk around, staring at puddles and deciding whether they looked haunted. Medieval laws weren't just irrational. They actively made life more difficult. But the worst part, most people followed them without question, simply because challenging them was dangerous. If there was a rule, no matter how absurd, it wasn't meant to be questioned. It was meant to be obeyed. Medieval laws didn't just enforce rules. They actively turned ordinary life into an unnecessary maze of restrictions, fear, and straight-up nonsense. If something existed, there was a real possibility that someone, somewhere, thought it was cursed, dangerous, or under the influence of supernatural forces. And unfortunately, that meant laws had to be made to control these imaginary threats. One of the worst offenders was the legal obsession with astrology. People did not make major decisions based on reason. They made them based on the position of the stars. Some regions required official documents to include astrological forecasts, meaning your fate wasn't determined by your own actions. It was determined by what some scholar thought Jupiter was doing that month. In certain cases, judges even consulted star charts before passing verdicts, fully believing that planetary alignment could influence crime. And speaking of laws that made absolutely no sense, let's talk about medieval bans on footwear. Some towns had specific regulations on how shoes could be worn, based on the idea that incorrect shoe placement could disrupt natural balance. One village even ruled that walking barefoot under a full moon was illegal, because it was believed that moonlight touching bare feet encouraged reckless behavior. Then there was the infamous issue of mirrors. Some medieval people thought mirrors could trap souls, leading to actual laws preventing excessive mirror use in homes. If someone stared at their reflection too long, people assumed they were trying to communicate with dark forces, which, of course, meant legal trouble. Things took a darker turn when spirits became a concern for property laws. If a house was declared haunted, landlords were sometimes required to either exorcise it or compensate future tenants for potential ghostly disturbances. In rare cases, written contracts included clauses requiring spirits to behave themselves, which raises the very serious question of how one gets a ghost to sign paperwork. And what about laws involving food? Those were just as unnecessary. People believed that eggs could be used in sorcery, which led to restrictions on how eggs could be stored, sold, and cooked in certain towns. Bread was a whole separate nightmare, with laws preventing the sale of loaves that hadn't been properly blessed, because clearly, an unblessed loaf was a disaster waiting to happen. Weather laws weren't much better. Some towns had official bans on discussing storms, because mentioning bad weather was believed to invite it into the village. If someone predicted a drought, they could be arrested for spreading dangerous ideas, because obviously, the best way to handle bad weather was to pretend it didn't exist. And let's not forget laws governing personal habits. Laughing too loudly in certain areas could get you fined, because excessive amusement was thought to provoke spirits. Sneezing incorrectly could be punished, especially if you failed to acknowledge that your soul might have briefly left your body. Medieval laws weren't about fairness or practicality. They were about controlling imaginary problems with very real punishments. If society could create a rule based on fear, it absolutely did, and somehow everyone followed them anyway. Superstition shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life, from medicine to warfare, dictating decisions in ways that seem utterly baffling today. Medicine, in particular, was filled with deeply questionable beliefs, many of which did more harm than good. Medieval physicians relied heavily on humoral theory, the idea that the body was controlled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these were out of balance, sickness occurred, which meant that treatments often involved bizarre methods like bloodletting, forced vomiting, or consuming crushed gemstones. Some healers believed that wearing a wolf's tooth could protect against epilepsy, while others prescribed carrying a baked onion in one's pocket to ward off the plague. Even the idea of wounds had its fair share of nonsense. It was commonly believed that if a weapon caused an injury, healing could be achieved not by treating the wound, but by anointing the weapon itself, known as sympathetic magic. This belief led some to keep old swords preserved with healing herbs long after the actual combat, hoping that the lingering energy would somehow retroactively fix the damage done. Battle itself was entangled with superstition, with knights and soldiers often wearing amulets or engaging in rituals before combat. Some believed that rubbing their swords with special oils or engraving mystical symbols onto their armor would make them invincible. Others carried religious relics, convinced that they would provide divine protection, regardless of actual military tactics. A few armies even refused to march if the alignment of the stars wasn't favorable, because obviously, a bad planetary configuration meant imminent defeat. Animals played a disturbingly large role in medieval superstition. Aside from cats being accused of witchcraft, owls were widely feared because their nocturnal cries were believed to predict death. A dog howling near a house could mean disaster for the residents, and people actively sought ways to repel the animal rather than investigate any rational cause. Crows and ravens were considered direct messengers of misfortune, leading some villages to impose bans on allowing them to nest nearby, as if forcing birds to relocate would somehow prevent tragedy. Superstition even dictated the placement of buildings. Some towns had rules about how houses should face, fearing that improperly aligned doorways might invite unwelcome spirits. Windows had to be positioned carefully to ensure good fortune, and people often buried objects beneath their homes, believing they would offer protection against supernatural forces. Shoes, animal bones, or even entire pots of salt were placed in walls or under floors, because clearly no malevolent spirit could withstand the power of strategically hidden footwear. Daily routines were infused with superstition, from how people ate to how they dressed. Many believed that spilling salt could cause bad luck unless it was immediately thrown over the left shoulder. Cutting one's nails on certain days was forbidden, as it could invite disaster, and whistling indoors was sometimes feared as a method of attracting mischievous spirits. Travelers often carried protective charms, convinced that without them, they might never reach their destination safely. Superstition wasn't just an occasional oddity in medieval life. It was everywhere, governing decisions, shaping laws, and ensuring that nearly everything had a mystical explanation. The sheer amount of irrational beliefs turned basic survival into an ongoing battle against imaginary forces. And somehow, people followed these traditions unquestioningly, accepting that if something went wrong, it was never just bad luck. It was a curse, a spiritual punishment, or the direct work of unseen entities. Medieval warfare was absolutely drenched in superstition, with knights, soldiers, and even entire armies making decisions based on omens, rituals, and outright nonsense, rather than strategy. One of the most widely believed superstitions was that certain weapons had mystical power. Some swords were thought to be cursed or blessed, with knights refusing to fight if they didn't have their chosen blade. If a sword was forged under the wrong astrological sign, people believed it could bring bad luck in battle, meaning some warriors outright refused weapons that had been made at the wrong time. Armor was just as suspicious. Many knights carved symbols into their shields, convinced it would make them invincible, which, unfortunately, didn't work. Some soldiers refused to wear new armor without performing a specific ritual, such as touching it against holy relics or whispering prayers into their helmets before putting them on. But the absolute worst superstition revolved around battlefield omens, because medieval people believed that the universe sent warnings before conflicts, and if you ignored them, you were doomed. If a flock of birds flew in a strange pattern before battle, that was a bad sign. If a dog barked too much the night before, definitely bad luck. If a horse refused to move forward, someone suggested cancelling the whole battle immediately. Some armies even delayed entire campaigns because of eclipses, comets, or storms, because obviously, the heavens were directly involved in medieval warfare. And let's not forget the bizarre obsession with magical relics. Many medieval leaders believed that owning a piece of a saint's body, like a bone or a preserved finger, could guarantee victory. These relics were often carried into battle, with soldiers convinced that having them nearby would protect them from enemy attacks. And then there were the superstitions about war animals, because yes, even horses, birds, and dogs were somehow involved in medieval battle paranoia. Some armies believed that training war horses under a full moon made them stronger, which meant that entire cavalry units were sometimes delayed just to wait for the right moon phase. Owls were feared because their cries were thought to predict death, and if one appeared near a battlefield, soldiers absolutely lost their minds over it. Medieval people didn't just fight wars. They fought imaginary forces, omens, curses, and suspicious birds at the same time. And somehow, they genuinely believed it was helping. One of the most famous examples of superstition affecting war was the Battle of Halley's Comet in 1066, which wasn't the official name, but might as well have been. In the months leading up to the Norman invasion of England, Halley's Comet appeared in the sky, and medieval people lost their minds over it. To the Anglo-Saxons, the comet was a bad omen, signalling that King Harold TI's reign was doomed. His court saw it as divine punishment for taking the throne under questionable circumstances, and many of his men felt uneasy about fighting with such a clear warning from the heavens hanging over them. On the other side, William the Conqueror saw the comet as a sign of victory, believing it was proof that he was destined to take England. His army felt emboldened, convinced that the universe itself was backing them. The result: William won. Whether Halley's Comet had anything to do with it is up for debate, but medieval people absolutely believed the stars had influenced the battle. Superstition in war didn't just involve the sky. It dictated how soldiers prepared, how they approached combat, and even whether battles happened at all. Entire armies delayed conflicts based on bad omens. Knights refused to fight if their swords weren't properly blessed. And some commanders made decisions based purely on the movements of birds. Medieval war wasn't just fought with steel. It was fought with fear, prophecy, and a deep, unquestioning belief in mystical forces guiding the outcome. Another striking event where superstition played a role in medieval warfare was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Fought between England and France during the 100 Years' War. Before the battle, King Henry V of England's army was exhausted, outnumbered, and deep in enemy territory. The French were confident they would win easily, given their superior numbers. But medieval superstition had a way of turning morale in strange directions. Henry V's men believed they were under divine protection, convinced that their cause was righteous, and that signs from the heavens favored them. Some even claimed that a sudden change in the wind before the battle was proof that God had shifted fate in their favor. Meanwhile, the French knights, who were weighed down by heavy armor and deeply entrenched in their own belief that fate ensured their victory, ignored crucial battle conditions that ultimately led to their downfall. The muddy battlefield, soaked from recent rain, made it nearly impossible for the heavily armored French soldiers to move effectively. English longbowmen, unburdened by heavy gear, rained arrows down upon them, turning what should have been an easy French victory into one of the most humiliating defeats in their history. Though the battle was won through strategy and luck, many English soldiers attributed their victory to divine intervention, further reinforcing the belief that medieval warfare wasn't just about skill. It was about reading the signs, interpreting omens, and trusting unseen forces. War wasn't just fought with swords, it was fought with superstition, and if history has proven anything, it's that belief in unseen forces could sometimes shift the course of battle just as much as steel. One of the most fascinating medieval wars steeped in superstition was the Battle of Crecy in 1346, fought between England and France during the 100 Years' War. This battle wasn't just a clash of military tactics, it was a moment where medieval fear, omens, and divine interpretations directly influenced decision-making. The superstitions that shaped Crecy, the days leading up to the battle, were filled with ominous signs. The weather had been erratic, with storms rolling across France, and some soldiers believed this was a warning from God. There were reports that strange lights had appeared in the night sky, which many thought were spirits watching the battle unfold before it even began. French knights, heavily influenced by their deep religious beliefs, performed elaborate rituals to ensure victory. Some carried relics of saints, believing they would be protected from English arrows. Others refused to fight until they received a direct blessing from priests, convinced that holy intervention was necessary to secure their success. But on the English side, King Edward III had a different approach. His troops were disciplined, well prepared, and more focused on strategy than superstition. His archers, the feared English longbowmen, had been trained to deliver a storm of arrows that could wipe out heavily armored knights. The disaster of the unbeatable. French knights believed that heavy armor and superior numbers would guarantee their victory. Many thought they were invincible, protected by their relics and blessed equipment. They charged aggressively, fully expecting to smash through English lines like divine warriors. But they didn't consider the terrain. The battlefield was muddy from recent rains, making it hard for knights to move. Their horses struggled, their charges slowed, and their massive weight became a deadly disadvantage. Then came the worst possible realization. The sky itself seemed to betray them. As they advanced, dark clouds covered the battlefield, casting deep shadows and making visibility difficult. This eerie shift made many believe something supernatural was happening. But it wasn't divine judgment. It was English archers preparing for destruction. The heavenly storm. That wasn't divine at all. When the longbowmen released their arrows, it felt like a storm crashing down upon the French. Thousands of arrows rained from the sky, cutting through armor, shields, and flesh, as knights struggled to move across the ruined battlefield. Many believed they were facing divine punishment, as their relics failed to protect them, and prayers did nothing to stop the assault. Some tried to retreat, believing the battle was cursed, but there was nowhere to run. The English devastated the French forces, proving that tactics and preparation mattered far more than superstition. Aftermath. How superstition shaped the memory of the battle following the defeat. Many French survivors tried to explain their failure through supernatural causes. Some claimed that a dark force had sabotaged them, while others suggested that England had harnessed mystical knowledge to predict their movements. But in reality, the Battle of Crecy was won because strategy defeated blind superstition. The fear of omens, misplaced belief in divine protection, and refusal to adapt to real world challenges led to one of France's most humiliating losses. A fascinating example of superstition influencing medieval warfare was the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, fought between the English and the Norse. This battle was a turning point in English history, but beyond the bloodshed and politics, superstitions played a powerful role in shaping the decisions made by both armies. The signs of doom before the invasion. The Norse king, Harald Hardrada, set out to invade England, believing it was his destiny to rule. His forces were fierce Viking warriors, ready to expand their power into new territory. But as the invasion began, superstition started creeping into the minds of his men. As they sailed across the sea, strange events unsettled the army. Reports emerged that flocks of ravens had followed the fleet, circling above their ships like omens of death. In Viking culture, ravens were deeply connected to Odin, the god of war. But they were also seen as messengers of approaching doom. The signs only got worse. Some warriors claimed to have unsettling dreams, seeing fires consuming their homeland, or shadows swallowing their weapons. For medieval warriors, dreams were not just random thoughts. They were believed to be direct warnings from supernatural forces. Despite these fears, Harold dismissed the concerns. He was a hardened warrior, believing that fate was already written, and no sign, no omen, no superstition could change that. The battle begins, and superstitions follow. Harald Hardrada's army marched into England, catching the local forces completely off guard. His men were confident, experienced, and ready to conquer. They had already won an early battle against the English, and many believed that victory was assured. But then, something happened that sent fear through the Viking ranks. As Harold and his troops camped at Stamford Bridge, reports came in that the English army was approaching, fast. And worse, they had arrived on an astrologically cursed day. In Norse belief, certain days were considered ill, fated for battle, meaning that if warriors fought on them, their strength would be drained, their luck would be ruined, and their deaths would be inevitable. It was believed that warriors who died on an unlucky battle day would not go to Valhalla, the legendary afterlife for Norse heroes. This meant that, for many warriors, losing on this day would be worse than just death. It would be eternal dishonor. Whispers of this spread through the ranks. Some warriors hesitated, questioning whether they should fight at all. Harold, however, had no patience for superstition. He ordered his men to prepare for battle, dismissing the fear and demanding that his warriors fight like true Vikings, no matter the omens. The unexpected collapse of the Viking army. The English forces, led by King Harold Godwinson, charged forward with unmatched speed, catching the Vikings before they could fully prepare their defences. The Norsemen fought fiercely, but they were poorly positioned, scattered across the field without proper armour. And then, Harold Hardrada was struck down. An arrow pierced his throat, killing him instantly. For the Vikings, this was an unimaginably bad omen. It wasn't just a fallen leader. It was a sign that fate had completely turned against them. As soon as word spread that Harold was dead, panic gripped the army. They had fought believing they were invincible, but now, their most feared warrior was gone. Some Vikings attempted to retreat, convinced that the battle was cursed, while others rushed forward in desperation, trying to reclaim their honor before the inevitable defeat. But the English forces overpowered them, pushing them back, killing thousands. Superstition and the final disaster. As the battle collapsed into a full Viking defeat, there was one last superstitious horror that haunted the battlefield. According to reports, some warriors claimed to see ravens circling the battlefield, just as they had before the invasion. But now, they were no longer messengers of war, they were symbols of death. Seeing these birds at the final moment of battle was an undeniable sign that fate had fully turned against them. The aftermath. How superstition defined the loss in the months following the battle. Survivors told stories of how fate had doomed them from the start. They spoke of the bad omens before the invasion, the ravens, the eerie dreams, and the cursed battle date. They claimed that Harold Hardrada's death proved that the gods had abandoned them, explaining why the once unbeatable Viking army had been slaughtered so easily. Even those who had dismissed superstition before the battle began believing in it afterward, convinced that the signs had been correct all along. The defeat at Stamford Bridge marked the beginning of the end for Viking power in England, and it was one of the last major Norse invasions before England fell into another war, one against the Normans just weeks later. The legacy of superstition in warfare, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, showed how deeply superstition was embedded in medieval combat. Soldiers did not just fight with swords and shields. They fought against unseen forces, against fate, against omens that threatened their confidence before they ever lifted a weapon. And sometimes, those fears could decide the battle before the first arrow was even fired. The medieval battlefield was not just a place of swords and strategy. It was a grand stage for absurd beliefs, mystical nonsense, and deeply questionable decision-making. Superstition wasn't just a side effect of medieval thinking. It was a core part of how wars were fought, won, and disastrously lost. And sometimes, people made their military choices based on omens, birds, and whether or not someone sneezed at the wrong moment. Take the infamous disaster of the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, during the 100 Years' War. The French forces, led by King John II, were armed to the teeth, ready to crush the English. But they had one serious problem. They deeply believed in celestial signs, and unfortunately, the stars did not look promising. Medieval knights were convinced that planetary alignment could influence fate, meaning that battle itself had an astrological calendar attached to it. Some believed that Mars had to be in a favorable position, while others insisted that the moon's phases had a direct impact on battlefield luck. Before the French forces even engaged in combat, some soldiers noticed strange weather patterns, causing quiet murmurs across the ranks. The sky was too cloudy. The wind was moving in an unnatural direction, and someone claimed that the birds were flying oddly. The conclusion: the heavens were unhappy with their cause, but instead of adjusting tactics, the French forces simply brushed off the concerns, convinced that raw strength would overpower any spiritual inconvenience. The problem was, the English forces didn't share these beliefs. They approached battle with strategy, practicality, and an absurdly good use of terrain, meaning that when the French charged into the battlefield, expecting divine blessings, they instead ran straight into a trap. Their heavy knights struggled to maneuver. Their forces were outplayed by English longbowmen, and their belief in celestial intervention did absolutely nothing to stop the arrows raining down on them. What made things worse was that certain French commanders had refused to fight on earlier days due to bad omens, meaning that by the time they did engage, morale had already sunk into superstition, fueled paranoia. When things started going badly, some soldiers became convinced that the battle itself had been cursed, leading to chaotic retreats, panicked horses, and one of the worst losses in French history. And then there's the infamous Battle of Castagnaro in 1387, which was less of a battlefield and more of an astrological experiment gone horribly wrong. The Italians, facing a tough military challenge, decided that instead of relying purely on tactics, they would also consult the stars. Their commanders delayed attacking for days, carefully observing the movement of planets, looking for the perfect moment to strike. Unfortunately, medieval astrology was not as useful as actual military strategy, and by the time the battle began, the opposing army had fully anticipated their move, countering them with overwhelming force. Superstition did not stop with celestial events. It controlled battlefield behaviors in deeply questionable ways. Take the belief in magical armor. Some knights refused to fight unless their armor had been properly blessed, convinced that a religious chant over their steel would make them immune to swords. Others believed that engraving mystical symbols onto shields would make arrows miss, which, unsurprisingly, never worked in real life. Even weapons weren't safe from superstition. Some commanders believed that certain swords were chosen by destiny, meaning that knights often refused to use weapons unless they had gone through elaborate rituals beforehand. Entire armies performed ceremonies before battle, waving swords in the air, calling upon divine spirits, and placing their faith in relics rather than proper military tactics. The result: the armies that relied on superstition were often completely obliterated by soldiers who focused on planning rather than divine intervention. One of the most ridiculous examples of superstition ruining a battlefield came during the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, when Flemish forces faced off against the French. The French knights, believing themselves to be protected by holy blessings, charged recklessly into battle, expecting victory to be preordained. Unfortunately, the battlefield was deeply unfavorable for mounted knights, and their decision to trust divine protection instead of terrain knowledge led to a catastrophic defeat. The Flemish soldiers, fighting strategically, picked apart the armoured knights, proving that superstitious confidence meant nothing against actual battlefield intelligence. And then, of course, there was the fear of bad omens before battle, which was widespread among medieval armies. Some warriors refused to fight if certain animals behaved strangely, believing that a crow flying in the wrong direction meant certain defeat. Others believed that if a horse refused to move forward, It was a sign that the army should turn back immediately. This led to actual delays in military campaigns, where entire groups of knights stood around waiting for the right sign before they were willing to engage in combat. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, the French and Hungarian forces suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Ottomans, largely because their overconfidence in divine protection made them underestimate their enemy. The Christian forces were deeply convinced that victory was destined, performing elaborate religious rituals before battle, believing that spiritual blessings would override military disadvantages. They ignored the reality of their situation, failed to coordinate properly, and their superstition-fueled arrogance led to one of the worst battlefield collapses of the medieval period. Superstition wasn't just a belief system. It was a battlefield strategy for many medieval armies. The problem: it was a spectacularly bad strategy. The soldiers who trusted omens, prayed for armor to become magical, and refused to fight on "oh lucky days," often found themselves facing armies that didn't care about astrology, just tactics. And the result was almost always disaster. Medieval Europe didn't just embrace superstition, it actively put superstition on trial. When something went wrong, people didn't always blame each other. Sometimes they looked around, found the nearest rat, pig, or donkey, and declared it was definitely you. Animals were routinely dragged into court, treated as fully responsible defendants, and charged with crimes ranging from property destruction to outright sorcery. And the worst part: these trials were taken very seriously. There were lawyers, witnesses, formal accusations, and sometimes even appeals, because, apparently, medieval people believed that justice was meaningless unless goats had legal representation. One of the most spectacular examples occurred in France in 1457, when a pig was put on trial for murder. Yes, an actual pig. The case was so serious that the town held a full legal proceeding, complete with judges, clerks, and townspeople watching intensely, fully believing they were witnessing a fair trial. The crime: the pig had allegedly attacked and killed a child. The prosecution argued that the pig acted with intent, which raises the deeply concerning question of how exactly does a pig commit premeditated murder, regardless of the logic, or lack thereof. The court ruled that the pig was guilty. It was sentenced to death, proving once again that medieval people had absolutely no idea how justice was supposed to work. But pigs weren't the only victims of medieval legal nonsense. Donkeys, cows, roosters, and even insects found themselves summoned before judges, accused of everything from ruining crops to working for witches. One spectacularly unnecessary event occurred in Switzerland in 1474, when a rooster was charged with sorcery. This was not just some casual accusation. The trial was officially recorded, with the bird being accused of laying an egg, which was a deeply unnatural thing to medieval minds. Rather than consider actual science, people immediately concluded that the rooster was working with dark forces. Instead of simply ignoring this ridiculous claim, the court held a formal hearing presenting arguments about the alleged magical properties of the egg. The rooster, unable to defend itself due to being a bird, was found guilty of consorting with evil forces and promptly executed. But things didn't stop with farm animals. Insects and rats were also thrown into courtrooms, sometimes on an absurdly large scale. In 1519, a group of field mice was summoned to trial in France after destroying crops, which is unfortunate for farmers, but wildly unnecessary to handle through the legal system. A public announcement was made, warning the mice to attend their hearing. Unsurprisingly, they did not show up, causing authorities to formally convict them in absentia, the ruling exile, because clearly telling mice to leave town would solve everything. Another particularly spectacular case occurred in 1606, when a swarm of locusts was charged with destruction of property. The town held an official trial, lawyers were involved, and arguments were made about whether the insects had acted maliciously. After careful deliberation, the court ruled against the locusts, declaring them guilty of criminal activity. The verdict: a religious curse would be placed upon them, ensuring that they would be driven away. Did the locusts leave? Probably. Did they leave because of the court case? Absolutely not. Medieval trials of animals weren't just misguided attempts at justice. They were deeply serious events, where people genuinely believed that holding formal hearings against birds, rodents, and farm animals would solve their problems. Nobody ever stopped and asked, "Are we the problem?" Instead, they took the nearest chicken, declared it guilty, and sentenced it for crimes that would make absolutely no sense in any normal world. The worst part: this didn't just happen once or twice. It happened regularly, across multiple centuries. One of the most unbelievably serious yet completely ridiculous animal trials in medieval history happened in 1474, Switzerland, when a rooster was accused of laying an egg. Now, for most people in the modern world, this would either be dismissed as nonsense or investigated scientifically. But in medieval Europe, this was an immediate emergency that required legal action. The moment the rooster's alleged crime was discovered, town officials were called in, deeply concerned that something unnatural had taken place. Chickens were predictable creatures. Hens laid eggs, roosters did not. And yet, here was this one highly suspicious rooster, supposedly defying nature in the worst possible way. To the medieval mind, there was only one explanation: this was absolutely sorcery. The townspeople didn't see this as some biological anomaly or a misunderstanding. Instead, they became convinced that the rooster was in league with dark forces. Egg laying, after all, was an exclusively female trait among chickens. If a rooster had laid an egg, that could only mean one thing: witchcraft was involved, and obviously, this chicken was the center of an evil conspiracy. Rather than simply ignoring the situation like reasonable people, they escalated the matter into a full trial, treating the rooster as a legitimate criminal defendant. Judges, clerks, and legal advisors assembled, ready to determine whether the bird had engaged in unnatural behavior with malicious intent. The accusation was grave. The rooster was charged with practicing dark magic, disturbing natural order, and collaborating with demonic forces. The prosecution argued that the egg laid by the rooster was not an ordinary egg. It was, in fact, a cockatrice egg. According to medieval superstition, cockatrices were terrifying creatures that hatched from eggs laid by roosters, growing into monstrous reptiles capable of killing people with a single glance. Clearly, this was a serious problem, because nobody wanted to wake up one morning and find their town terrorized by a mythical beast that only existed because a bird didn't follow normal poultry rules. The trial progressed exactly as you would expect for a medieval animal courtroom disaster. Witnesses testified that they had seen the rooster behaving suspiciously, which raises the important question of what does a bird have to do to look suspicious? One local swore that the rooster had been seen pacing in circles, as if plotting something. Another claimed that it had crowed in an unnaturally deep tone, which obviously meant it was chanting something evil. Nobody considered that maybe the rooster was just being a rooster. Instead, they continued with deep legal debates about poultry sorcery. discussing whether the egg should be destroyed immediately or studied further for signs of demonic activity. Unsurprisingly, the rooster was found guilty. The court ruled that the bird had absolutely engaged in unnatural, malicious behavior, threatening the town with an apocalyptic monster that could hatch at any moment. The verdict: execution. Because apparently the only proper response to an inexplicably egg-laying rooster was a medieval-style death sentence. The rooster was burned at the stake, which, ironically, was the same punishment reserved for human witches. One can only imagine how utterly confused this rooster was, standing in the town square, surrounded by judges, torch-wielding townsfolk, and self-important officials, all convinced that they were protecting their society from a poultry-related supernatural disaster. And when it was over, life went on as if nothing had happened. Nobody questioned whether the trial had made sense. Nobody reflected on whether their justice system had gone completely off the rails. Instead, the medieval court walked away feeling victorious, confident that they had saved humanity from an evil chicken conspiracy. The trial of the egg-laying rooster remains one of the most absurd examples of medieval superstition, overriding all reason. It was not just an embarrassing moment for legal history. It was definitive proof that medieval people could, and would escalate the most ridiculous situations into full-blown supernatural crises. And the worst part, this was not an isolated incident. Medieval courts tried pigs, rats, donkeys, and even swarms of insects, treating them like fully responsible criminals, instead of just animals behaving like animals. Medieval Europe had many questionable legal practices, but few were as spectacularly ridiculous as the time a group of rats was put on trial in 1522. Yes, actual rats. Not just one unfortunate rodent, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. An entire swarm of them was formally summoned to court, accused of destroying crops and causing economic disaster. The case took place in Autun, France, where the local farmers had suffered massive losses due to rats eating their grain. Instead of handling this problem like normal people, they decided that the only reasonable solution was to sue the rats. A formal complaint was filed, and the court agreed to hear the case. Because apparently medieval judges had nothing better to do than prosecute rodents. The trial began with a full legal team assembled, including a lawyer assigned to defend the rats. This was not just some random guy forced into the role. This was Bartholomew Chassany, a highly respected attorney who somehow found himself arguing in favor of vermin rights. The prosecution laid out their case, explaining that the rats had caused severe damage to crops, leading to food shortages and financial ruin. They demanded justice, insisting that the rats must be punished for their crimes. Now, at this point, any reasonable person would have stopped and asked, "Are we seriously doing this?" But medieval people, they doubled down. Chassany, realizing that he was somehow responsible for defending an entire species, crafted one of the most absurd legal defenses in history. His first argument: the rats had not been properly summoned. In medieval law, a defendant had the right to be formally notified of their trial. Since the rats had not received an official summons, Chassany argued that the case could not proceed until they had been properly informed. The judge, instead of laughing this out of court, agreed. A formal summons was issued, ordering the rats to appear in court. Days passed. The rats, unsurprisingly, did not show up. The prosecution demanded swift punishment, but Chassany was not done yet. His next argument: the rats were too afraid to travel. He explained that the roads leading to the courthouse were dangerous, filled with cats, dogs, and other predators. Since medieval law protected defendants from undue harm, Chasney insisted that the rats could not be expected to attend the trial unless they were guaranteed safe passage. The judge, instead of throwing him out, agreed again. At this point, the trial had become a full-scale disaster, with legal experts debating whether rats had the right to avoid danger while traveling to court. The prosecution, now visibly frustrated, demanded a final ruling. But Chasney had one last trick, his final argument. The rats were not a single entity. They were individuals. Since medieval law required specific defendants to be named, Chasney argued that the court could not convict rats as a group. They would need to identify each rat individually and charge them separately. The judge, now fully exhausted by this nonsense, had no choice but to dismiss the case. The rats won the trial, escaping all punishment, and Chasney became famous for his legal brilliance. Instead of being ridiculed for defending vermin, he was celebrated as a master of legal strategy, going on to have a successful career in law, proving that sometimes arguing in favor of rats can actually boost your reputation. One of the most spectacularly ridiculous animal trials in medieval history took place in Falaise, France, in 1386, when a pig was put on trial for murder. Yes, an actual pig. Not just a pig accused of stealing food or causing trouble. This pig was charged with the full crime of homicide, treated as a fully responsible defendant, and sentenced to death in the most dramatic way possible. The case began when a sow allegedly attacked and killed a child, which, to medieval minds, was not just a tragic accident. It was a criminal act that required justice. Instead of handling this situation like reasonable people, the town officials decided that the pig must be tried in court, because obviously, the only way to handle a rogue farm animal was through the full legal system. The trial was a grand event, with judges, clerks, and an audience of deeply invested townspeople, all gathered to watch justice unfold. The pig was brought into the courtroom, and in an effort to make the trial even more absurd, it was dressed in human clothes, because apparently, nothing says fair trial like forcing a pig to wear pants. The prosecution laid out their case, arguing that the pig had acted with intent, which raises the deeply concerning question of how exactly does a pig commit premeditated murder. Witnesses were called, and several people testified that they had seen the pig behaving aggressively, which, to be fair, is not unusual behavior for a pig. But medieval people were not interested in logical explanations. They were fully committed to treating this pig like a criminal mastermind. The defense, which was somehow assigned to an actual lawyer, attempted to argue that the pig was not responsible for its actions, because, obviously, it was a pig. But medieval courts were not known for their mercy, and the judges were fully convinced that the pig had committed a crime worthy of execution. The verdict: guilty. The punishment: death by hanging. Because apparently, the only proper response to a pig-related crime was a full medieval execution. The pig was dragged to the town square, where a massive crowd had gathered to witness the event. It was placed in a noose, and in a final act of medieval absurdity, the executioner carried out the sentence, as if he were dealing with a human criminal. The crowd watched in solemn silence, fully believing that justice had been served, because clearly, the best way to prevent future pig-related crimes was to make an example out of this one unfortunate sow. The trial of the murderous pig remains one of the most absurd examples of medieval superstition and legal nonsense, proving that people in the Middle Ages were fully willing to treat farm animals as dangerous criminals. And the worst part, this was not an isolated incident. medieval courts tried pigs, rats, donkeys, and even swarms of insects, treating them like fully responsible criminals, instead of just animals behaving like animals. One of the most spectacularly ridiculous animal trials in medieval history took place in Saint Julien, France, between 1545 and 1587, when a group of weevils was formally prosecuted for destroying vineyards. Yes, actual weevils. Tiny, grain-eating insects. Not just a single unfortunate bug caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a full-scale legal proceeding against an entire species, treated as if they were a criminal organization plotting against humanity. The case began when local farmers noticed that their vineyards were being ravaged, with crops disappearing at an alarming rate. Instead of handling this situation like reasonable people, they decided that the only logical solution was to sue the weevils. A formal complaint was filed, and the court agreed to hear the case, because apparently, medieval judges had nothing better to do than prosecute insects. The trial was a grand event, with judges, clerks, and an audience of deeply invested townspeople, all gathered to watch justice unfold. The weevils were assigned a legal defender, because obviously fair representation was important, even for bugs. The prosecution laid out their case, arguing that the weevils had caused severe damage to vineyards, leading to economic disaster and food shortages. They demanded justice, insisting that the insects must be punished for their crimes. Now, at this point, any reasonable person would have stopped and asked, "Are we seriously doing this?" But medieval people, they doubled down. The defense, which was somehow assigned to an actual lawyer, crafted one of the most absurd legal defenses in history. His first argument: the weevils had not been properly summoned. In medieval law, a defendant had the right to be formally notified of their trial. Since the weevils had not received an official summons, the lawyer argued that the case could not proceed until they had been properly informed. The judge, instead of laughing this out of court, agreed. A formal summons was issued, ordering the weevils to appear in court. Days passed. The weevils, unsurprisingly, did not show up. The prosecution demanded swift punishment, but the defense was not done yet. His next argument: the weevils were acting according to natural law. He explained that the insects were simply following their instincts, consuming crops as part of their natural survival process, since medieval law protected creatures acting within their natural rights. He insisted that the weevils could not be held accountable for doing what they were biologically programmed to do. The judge, instead of throwing him out, agreed again. At this point, the trial had become a full-scale disaster, with legal experts debating whether insects had the right to eat crops without facing criminal charges. The prosecution, now visibly frustrated, demanded a final ruling. But the defense had one last trick. His final argument: the weevils should be granted land. Since medieval law allowed settlements between parties, he proposed that instead of exterminating the weevils, the town should grant them a section of land where they could live without interfering with human agriculture. The judge, now fully exhausted by this nonsense, had no choice but to accept the proposal. The weevils won the trial, escaping all punishment, and were officially granted land to inhabit, proving once again that medieval people had absolutely no idea how justice was supposed to work. Instead of being ridiculed for defending insects, the lawyer was celebrated for his legal brilliance, going on to have a successful career in law, proving that medieval Europe had many questionable legal practices, but few were as spectacularly ridiculous as the time a group of rats was put on trial in 1522. Yes, actual rats. Not just one unfortunate rodent caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. An entire swarm of them was formally summoned to court, accused of destroying crops and causing economic disaster. The case took place in Autun, France, where the local farmers had suffered massive losses due to rats eating their grain. Instead of handling this problem like normal people, they decided that the only reasonable solution was to sue the rats. A formal complaint was filed, and the court agreed to hear the case, because apparently medieval judges had nothing better to do than prosecute rodents. The trial began with a full legal team assembled, including a lawyer assigned to defend the rats. This was not just some random guy forced into the role. This was Bartholomew Chasseny, a highly respected attorney who somehow found himself arguing in favor of vermin rights. The prosecution laid out their case, explaining that the rats had caused severe damage to crops, leading to food shortages and financial ruin. They demanded justice, insisting that the rats must be punished for their crimes. Now, at this point, any reasonable person would have stopped and asked, "Are we seriously doing this?" But medieval people, they doubled down. Chasseny, realizing that he was somehow responsible for defending an entire species, crafted one of the most absurd legal defenses in history. His first argument: the rats had not been properly summoned. In medieval law, a defendant had the right to be formally notified of their trial. Since the rats had not received an official summons, Chasseny argued that the case could not proceed until they had been properly informed. The judge, instead of laughing this out of court, agreed. A formal summons was issued, ordering the rats to appear in court. Days passed. The rats, unsurprisingly, did not show up. The prosecution demanded swift punishment, but Chasseny was not done yet. His next argument: the rats were too afraid to travel. He explained that the roads leading to the courthouse were dangerous, filled with cats, dogs, and other predators. Since medieval law protected defendants from undue harm, Chasseny insisted that the rats could not be expected to attend the trial unless they were guaranteed safe passage. The judge, instead of throwing him out, agreed again. At this point, the trial had become a full-scale disaster, with legal experts debating whether rats had the right to avoid danger while traveling to court. The prosecution, now visibly frustrated, demanded a final ruling, but Chasseny had one last trick. His final argument: the rats were not a single entity. They were individuals. Since medieval law required specific defendants to be named, Chasseny argued that the court could not convict rats. As a group, they would need to identify each rat individually and charge them separately. The judge, now fully exhausted by this nonsense, had no choice but to dismiss the case. The rats won the trial, escaping all punishment, and Chasseny became famous for his legal brilliance. Instead of being ridiculed for defending vermin, he was celebrated as a master of legal strategy, going on to have a successful career in law, proving that sometimes arguing in favor of rats can actually boost your reputation. Medieval medicine was less about curing diseases and more about wild guesses, deeply questionable treatments, and an unwavering belief that the stars, demons, and bad smells controlled human health. If you got sick, doctors didn't ask, "Did you catch something from another person?" Because germ theory didn't exist yet. Instead, they asked, "Did you anger the stars?" One of the most spectacularly ridiculous medical events in medieval history was the Black Death of 1351, which killed millions across Europe. But beyond the tragedy, the way people tried to cure and prevent the plague was a full-scale disaster of superstition, nonsense, and deeply misguided confidence in bad ideas. the superstitions that shaped the Black Death response. When the plague arrived, medieval doctors had absolutely no idea what was happening. They didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or how diseases spread. Instead, they believed that the cause of the Black Death was either divine punishment, bad air, or an unfortunate alignment of planets. Some physicians consulted astrological charts, convinced that the movement of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn had triggered the outbreak. Others believed that the disease was sent by God to punish sinners, leading to mass public flagellation, where people whipped themselves in the streets, hoping to cleanse their souls and stop the plague. Then, there was the fear of bad smells, because medieval people believed that foul odors carried disease. This led to some of the worst medical advice in history, including carrying bundles of herbs, soaking cloths in vinegar, and, most horrifyingly, holding a dead animal against your face to counteract the plague air. A curus that absolutely did not work. Medieval doctors, desperate to stop the plague, prescribed treatments that ranged from mildly useless to actively dangerous. One of the most infamous cures was bloodletting, where physicians cut open veins to drain bad blood from the body. This was supposed to restore balance to the four humors, but in reality, it just made people weaker and more likely to die. Another popular treatment was placing live chickens on infected areas, because obviously, nothing solves a deadly pandemic like aggressively applying poultry to the problem. Some doctors recommended bathing in urine, because medieval people firmly believed that human waste had medicinal properties. Others suggested drinking crushed emeralds, which was not only wildly expensive, but also completely ineffective. And then there was the plague doctor outfit, which included a long beaked mask filled with herbs. The idea was that the herbs would filter out bad air, but in reality, it did absolutely nothing, except make doctors look terrifying. The mass panic that made everything worse. As the plague spread, people became increasingly desperate, leading to some of the worst decisions in medical history. One of the most infamous events was the mass killing of cats, because medieval people believed that cats were spreading the disease. Unfortunately, this only made things worse, because fewer cats meant more rats, and rats were actually carrying the plague. Then there were the plague processions, where entire towns marched through the streets, chanting prayers and carrying religious relics, convinced that public displays of faith would drive the disease away. Instead, these gatherings just helped spread the plague faster. Some cities banned fresh air, believing that wind carried disease, leading to people sealing their homes and suffocating themselves in their own filth. Others burned massive piles of herbs, convinced that smoke would cleanse the air, which only resulted in cities smelling like a giant medieval barbecue. The aftermath. How superstition shaped the memory of the plague after the Black Death finally faded. Medieval people did not reflect on their mistakes. Instead, they doubled down on superstition, convinced that the plague had been a supernatural event rather than a medical crisis. Doctors continued to prescribe nonsense treatments. Cities kept banning fresh air, and people remained deeply committed to the idea that bad smells, planetary movements, and divine punishment controlled human health. The Black Death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a spectacular display of medieval superstition, overriding all logic, proving that when faced with a deadly pandemic, medieval people would rather hold a chicken against their face than consider actual science. One of the most spectacularly ridiculous medical events in medieval history was the Dancing Plague of 1518, which saw hundreds of people in Strasbourg, France, suddenly start dancing uncontrollably for weeks. This was not a fun festival or a spontaneous celebration. It was a full-scale medical crisis, where people danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, injury, or even death. The superstitions that shaped the dancing plague response. When the outbreak began, medieval doctors had absolutely no idea what was happening. They didn't know about neurological disorders, mass hysteria, or psychological conditions. Instead, they believed that the cause of the dancing plague was either divine punishment, demonic possession, or an unfortunate alignment of planets. Some physicians consulted astrological charts, convinced that the movement of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn had triggered the outbreak. Others believed that the disease was sent by God to punish sinners, leading to mass public prayers and religious ceremonies. Then there was the fear of supernatural forces, because medieval people believed that spirits could influence human behavior. This led to some of the worst medical advice in history, including forcing dancers to continue moving until the curse ran its course. The cures that absolutely did not work. Medieval doctors, desperate to stop the plague, prescribed treatments that ranged from mildly useless to actively dangerous. One of the most infamous cures was forcing people to dance even more, because physicians believed that the only way to stop the plague was to let it burn itself out. This led to towns setting up designated dancing areas, complete with musicians hired to keep the afflicted moving. Another popular treatment was bloodletting, where physicians cut open veins to drain bad blood from the body. This was supposed to restore balance to the four humors, but in reality, it just made people weaker and more likely to collapse. Some doctors recommended drinking strange herbal mixtures, convinced that certain plants could counteract the supernatural forces causing the plague. Others suggested wearing blessed amulets, because obviously, nothing solves a medical crisis like aggressively accessorizing. And then there was the belief that loud noises could scare away evil spirits, leading to towns ringing church bells, banging pots, and shouting prayers in the streets. The mass panic that made everything worse. As the dancing plague spread, people became increasingly desperate, leading to some of the worst decisions in medical history. One of the most infamous events was the mass exorcisms, where priests attempted to drive out the demons supposedly possessing the dancers. And unfortunately, this did absolutely nothing, because the afflicted continued dancing even after being blessed with holy water. Then there were the plague processions, where entire towns marched through the streets, chanting prayers and carrying religious relics, convinced that public displays of faith would drive the disease away. Instead, these gatherings just helped spread the hysteria further. Some cities banned music, believing that certain melodies triggered the plague, leading to musicians being arrested for playing instruments. Others burned massive piles of herbs, convinced that smoke would cleanse the air, which only resulted in cities smelling like a giant medieval barbecue. The aftermath. How superstition shaped the memory of the dancing plague. After the dancing plague finally faded, medieval people did not reflect on their mistakes. Instead, they doubled down on superstition, convinced that the outbreak had been a supernatural event rather than a medical crisis. Doctors continued to prescribe nonsense treatments. Cities kept banning music, and people remained deeply committed to the idea that spirits, planetary movements, and divine punishment controlled human health. The dancing plague wasn't just a tragedy. It was a spectacular display of medieval superstition, overriding all logic, proving that when faced with a mysterious outbreak, medieval people would rather force victims to keep dancing, then consider actual science. And thus, we conclude our spectacular journey through medieval nonsense, where people put pigs on trial, feared bread, fought wars based on bad astrology, and handled plagues by aggressively applying chickens to their faces. It was a world of wild assumptions, where basic logic was optional and superstition controlled everything. But here's the good news. You, my dear listener, do not live in medieval Europe. Nobody is going to drag your cat into court. Nobody is going to force you to wear garlic around your neck to protect your soul. And most importantly, nobody is going to declare that your sneeze disrupted the cosmic balance and curse your entire family over it. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are not in danger of a midnight witch trial. So rest easy, knowing that the only thing haunting your dreams tonight is the ghost of medieval stupidity, gently whispering, "Why did they do any of this? Sleep well. And if a rooster lays an egg outside your window, you didn't see anything? Good night."